Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, is a city of dualities. It is the Athens of the North, a beacon of the Scottish Enlightenment where philosophy and reason flourished. Yet beneath that intellectual veneer lies the Old Town, a place of narrow winds, suffocating closes, and a history steeped in blood and smoke. It is a city that has always lived comfortably with its ghosts, and looming over it all is Arthur's Seat. An extinct volcano, a sleeping lion of rock, 822 feet above the city. It served as a site for Iron Age forts, witnessed centuries of ritual and heartache, and has been proposed as a location for King Arthur's Camelot.
Camelot! 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 It's only a model.
But in the summer of 1836, this ancient hill gave up a mystery that wasn't ancient at all. It wasn't Roman gold or a prehistoric weapon. It was a small, hidden cache that pointed to recent death, grief, and perhaps a guilty conscience. It remains one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in Scottish history. Today, we're looking into the riddle of the 17 miniature coffins of Arthur's Seat, where history speaks. To understand the mystery, we go back to late June 1836. A group of local boys, some accounts say 3, others 5, were scrambling up the northeastern slopes of Arthur's Seat. They weren't looking for history, they were hunting rabbits. While searching for burrows near a spot called the Windy Gowl, they noticed something odd. In a small recess in the rock face, someone had placed 3 thin pieces of slate. These weren't fallen rocks. They'd been cut into a rough shape and propped up to shield whatever lay behind them. The boys pried the slates away. Behind them, a small cave, about a foot high and 18 inches wide, and inside, staring back at them, was something no one could explain. 17 miniature coffins, arranged with care in 3 tiers, 2 rows of 8 and a single coffin on top, as if a third row had just begun. These weren't crude lumps of wood. Each coffin was between 3 and 4 inches long, carved from Scots pine, with a separate lid pinned down, and inside each one lay an occupant. The lids came off to reveal miniature wooden figures, dressed from head to foot in cotton clothes, stitched and glued around them. Their faces were carved with wide-open eyes, staring blankly. Unfortunately, the boys didn't recognize what they'd found. In a moment of destruction, they reportedly pelted the coffins at each other. The Scotsman newspaper later called them unmeaning and contemptible trifles. Only 8 of the original 17 made it down the hill. Those survivors eventually found their way to Robert Fraser, a jeweller on South Andrews Street, who displayed them in his private museum. When the collection was auctioned in 1845, the coffins sold for around £4, which equals around £520 or $700 today. But the question remained, what were they? When the story first broke in The Scotsman in July 1836, the press jumped straight to the supernatural. The article proclaimed,
"And our own opinion would be that there are still some of the weird sisters hovering about, who retain their ancient power to work the spells of death by entombing the likenesses of those they wish to destroy."
A satanic spell manufactory, sensational stuff. The idea was that these were effigies, voodoo dolls, buried to curse the living. But this theory falls apart fast. Witchcraft effigies are usually tortured, pierced with pins, melted. These figures were treated with care, dressed respectfully, laid out as if for burial. They weren't meant to harm. They were meant to rest. Other theories circulated through Victorian Edinburgh. Some said they followed a Saxon custom to honour friends who died in distant lands. Others suggested they were mimic burials by wives of sailors lost at sea, giving their husbands a Christian resting place when their bodies never came home. Poetic. But there was no evidence, no record of such customs in Scotland. The mystery went cold for over a century. The coffins sat in the National Museum of Scotland, silent, waiting, until the 1990s. That's when science finally took a proper look. In 1994, researchers Alan Simpson and Samuel Menifee published the first serious study of the artifacts. Their findings changed everything. First, the wood, Scots pine. Carved not with a carpenter's chisel, but with a sharp hooked knife, the kind found in a cobbler's kit. The tin decorations on the coffins resembled shoe buckles. This suggested the creator wasn't a cabinet maker, more likely a cobbler or leather worker. Second, the figures themselves. The wooden men weren't made specifically for these coffins. Their upright posture, flat feet and swinging arms suggested they were originally toy soldiers. Some even had their arms removed just to fit inside the boxes. But the key evidence was the fabric. The little figures were sewn into shrouds using cotton thread that only became common in Scotland around 1830. This meant the coffins couldn't be ancient relics or medieval spells. They were buried between 1830 and 1836. So we're looking for an event in Edinburgh involving 17 deaths sometime shortly before 1836. And when you look at the dark history of this city, one atrocity screams out from the archives. To understand it, we need to talk about the darker side of the Scottish Enlightenment. In the early 1800s, Edinburgh was the world capital of medical study. Students flocked here to learn anatomy, but to learn anatomy, you needed bodies to cut open. By law, anatomists could only use the bodies of executed criminals, but there were too many students, not enough hangings. This shortage created a gruesome industry, the resurrection men. These were organized gangs. They had spies who watched for funerals of the poor. They could dig down to a coffin, snap the lid, and hoist a body out with ropes in less than 20 minutes. The fear in Edinburgh was real. Families invented desperate ways to protect their dead. If you walk through Edinburgh's graveyards today, you can still see the evidence. Heavy iron cages called mort safes clamped over graves to stop the diggers. Tall stone watchtowers where armed guards sat through the night watching for lanterns in the dark. But in the West Port district, two Irish immigrants looked at this industry and saw an inefficiency. William Burke and William Hare realized that digging up graves was hard, dangerous work. They found a more efficient way, and an infinitely more nefarious one. It started by accident in November 1827. A lodger in Hare's boarding house, an old army pensioner named Donald, died of natural causes while owing £4 in rent. To recoup the loss, Burke and Hare sold Donald's body to Dr. Robert Knox, a famous anatomy lecturer. Knox paid them £7.10, or around $1,200 today, almost double what Donald owed. They realized something. A dead body was worth more than a living lodger, but rather than wait for people to die, they decided to help them along. Over the next year, Burke and Hare murdered 16 people. Their method was simple and brutal. Lure victims into the lodging house, ply them with whiskey until they could barely move. Then one man would hold the victim's nose and mouth shut while the other lay across their chest to stop them from breathing. It left no marks. It was clinically undetectable. The technique became known as burking. They killed the vulnerable, the elderly, the poor, prostitutes, the mentally disabled. They killed Daft Jamie, a well-known local character. They killed Mary Patterson, a young woman whose appearance so struck Dr. Knox that he preserved her body in whiskey for 3 months before dissecting her. In total, they sold 17 bodies to Dr. Knox, 1 natural death, 16 murders, 17 bodies, 17 miniature coffins. The numbers match, but the connection goes deeper. In 1820s, Scotland, dissection wasn't just a medical procedure, it was a fate worse than death. Many believed in the literal resurrection of the body. If your remains were cut apart by anatomists, you could not rise again on Judgment Day. The victims of Burke and Hare, poor, marginalized, friendless, were completely erased. No funerals, no graves, their remains scattered across lecture halls. The killing spree ended in November 1828 when lodgers discovered a body under Burke's bed. Hare turned King's evidence, testified against Burke in exchange for his freedom, and walked free. Burke wasn't so lucky. On January 28, 1829, William Burke was hanged at Edinburgh's Lawn Market. A crowd of 25,000 gathered to watch. When his body dropped, the cheer was heard 3 miles away in the port of Leith. But his punishment didn't end at the gallows. The judge had ordered that Burke's body be publicly dissected, the same fate he'd condemned his victims to. Professor Alexander Monroe, a rival of Dr. Knox, performed the dissection. The next day, over 30,000 members of the public filed through to view the man who had sold bodies for science, now laid out on a slab himself. His skeleton still hangs in the Anatomical Museum at Edinburgh University. You can see it today. So, what about the coffins? The theory, supported by the National Museum of Scotland, suggests the coffins were a mimic burial. Someone, maybe someone who knew the killers, maybe just a horrified citizen, created these effigies to give the victims the peace they were denied. They buried them on Arthur's Seat, a place of ancient significance, hoping the earth would grant them the rest the anatomy table could not. There's even evidence pointing to who might have made them. Remember the forensic analysis? The coffins were made using the tools and materials of a cobbler. William Burke had worked as a cobbler. Since Burke was executed, it's unlikely he made them himself, but the tin decorations resemble shoe buckles. It's possible a close associate, someone who worked with Burke, or a guilt-ridden member of their circle, crafted these tributes. Some have even speculated it could have been someone connected to Dr. Knox, trying to atone for the horrors they'd enabled. But history is rarely neat. There's a flaw in the Burke and Hare theory. Of the 17 victims, 12 were women. Yet every single figure found in the coffins is dressed in male clothing. If this was a memorial to Mary Patterson or the other female victims, why dress them as men? Skeptics argue that if the maker was using repurposed toy soldiers, they worked with what they had. Perhaps the gender didn't matter as much as the act of burial itself. They were creating symbolic vessels for the soul, regardless of the wooden form underneath. This discrepancy led to a rival theory. In April 2018, amateur historian Jeff Nisbet proposed that the coffins weren't about murder at all. They were about revolution. In 1820, Scotland saw the Radical War, a week-long uprising of workers and weavers demanding reform. It ended badly. 3 ringleaders were executed, 19 were transported to Australia. Nisbet points out that the figures have their eyes open. He suggests this means they're not yet dead, symbolising the men banished to Australia who were alive but gone from Scotland forever. The uprising was led by weavers, explaining the careful fabric work. And those unemployed weavers were put to work building a path around Arthur's Seat, known to this day as the Radical Road, the very path the boys were climbing near. Could the coffins be a secret memorial, buried by the rebels to keep the flame of revolution lit under the establishment's nose? It fits the male figures, but unlike the Burke and Hare theory, the numbers don't quite align. 22 versus 17. Just when you think this story is settled into the history books, it takes another turn. In December 2014, the National Museum of Scotland received an anonymous package. Inside, a brand new miniature coffin titled 18, beautifully made. A replica containing a figure and a handwritten label. The label quoted the ending of Robert Louis Stevenson's short story, The Body Snatcher, a tale directly inspired by Burke and Hare. The quote, "The body of the dead and long dissected grey." This tribute proves the dark pull of these coffins hasn't faded. Whoever sent it, artist, historian or prankster, was paying homage to the link between these wooden dolls and the crimes of the Resurrection Men. The coffins have also found their way into fiction. Crime writer Ian Rankin featured them in his 2001 Inspector Rebus thriller, The Falls. In the introduction, he wrote, As soon as I saw them, I knew they would make a great story, especially as no one had come up with an incontrovertible interpretation of their meaning. He was right. So, what are they? Witchcraft, a rebel's secret code, or a mournful apology to the victims of serial killers? The evidence points most strongly to the Burke and Hare connection, the fabric dating to the 1830s, the cobbler's tools, the match of the number 17. It's the most plausible explanation we have. If this theory holds, these aren't just strange dolls. They're an attempt to heal a wound that couldn't be healed. In a city that sold its own people for science, someone took the time to carve, dress, and bury 17 little proxies. They climbed the windy slopes of an ancient volcano and built a secret mausoleum for the friendless souls who ended up on Dr. Knox's table. They're a reminder that even in the darkest times, when human life is treated as a commodity, there's still a need to honour the dead. If you ever find yourself in Edinburgh, you can see the surviving 8 coffins at the National Museum of Scotland. 4th floor. They're small, easy to miss. But now you know what they carry. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into Scotland's dark history, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments, Burke and Hare or something else entirely.